Variables and types. In this video, we'll discuss the basics of storing information. Firstly, what is a variable? A variable stores information so that it can be accessed, used, and modified later in the program. This is similar to how we use Google Drive or a USB flash drive. We store files in Google Drive or a flash drive so that we can access it, use, and or modify those files later on in the future. Every variable has three components: a name, which is what we use to access the variable. Each variable has a type, which is simply the type of information that's being stored in the variable. And each variable has a value, which is the specific information being stored. So, how do we create a variable in Python? Let's go to our code editor and our output console. Here is an example of creating a variable in Python. Let's break down this statement piece by piece. The first part is the name of the method. In this case, the name we're using is simply greeting. After the name comes the equal sign, which is in Python known as the assignment operator. In Python, this operator is used for storing a value inside of a variable. Then, on the right side of the operator is the value we want stored, more specifically, hello world. Now that this value is stored inside a variable, we can print it out. So, when the Python interpreter executes this program, the value that's stored in greeting is what gets output, not the name of the variable, but the value that gets stored inside of it, which is hello world. I can also print out the type of the variable by using the type method. By printing out the type of the method, here's my output. Now, this looks pretty weird, but what I want you to focus on in that second line is the part that says str, which is the type of the value stored in greeting. str is short for string. A string contains a sequence of 0 or more characters, also known as text, enclosed inside quotation marks. The characters can be numbers, letters, spaces, punctuation, symbols, etc., etc. Examples include hello, ABC123, me at CFISD, so on and so forth. Here's another example of creating a variable in Python. In this case, I gave my variable the name myNumber, and I gave it the value 25. Hence, when I print it out along with this type, I get the value 25, and for the type, I get int. What is an int? An int is short for integer. An integer is a whole number, meaning it has no decimal component. Examples include 0, -8, 25, so on and so forth. As you can see, an integer can be positive, negative, and 0. Some non-examples would be 8.5. 8.5 is not an integer because it has a decimal component. Also, 25 enclosed in double quotation marks is not an integer. Even though, as we know, 25 is a whole number, by putting it inside quotation marks, this changes the type. Python will interpret that as a string instead. And this is a big deal in Python because the type that you store a value as will determine what actions you can perform with it later on in your program. There are some actions Python will allow you to do with a string that you cannot do with an integer. And conversely, there are actions Python will allow you to do with an integer that you cannot do with a string. So it's important to know that the number 25 is not the same as the number 25 enclosed in quotation marks when you're talking about Python. Here's another example of creating a variable in Python. Here I create a third variable called myNumber2. I set equal to 5.5, and that's when I print it out along with its type. I, of course, get 5.5, and for the type, I get float. What is a float? A float is like an integer, except it does have a decimal component. Examples include -3.2, 0.0, 15.7542, so on and so forth. Non-examples. The number 0, simply written as that, is not a float. Even though 0 is technically the same as 0.0 as far as humans are concerned, The Python interpreter will only interpret 0 as an int. If you need it to be interpreted as a float, then you need the decimal component. Also, if you put the 0.0 or any float value inside quotation marks, the Python interpreter will not interpret it as a float. It will instead interpret it as a string. Now, earlier in the program, I mentioned that when variables can be used to not only access and use information, but it can also be used to modify that information later on in the program. So, building on the example we just observed, let's say I write additional code, assigning my number 2 a new value. Now I'm assigning it the string weare1. When I print that out, along with the type, weare1 gets output, and now we have a new type, string. Again, the variable started off as 5.5 and as a float, but then later on in the program, we modified it to have a new value, and thus now has a new type.